Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. I'm Ben, and that is my 2025 Suzuki DRZ4S, and this is my 2018 Suzuki DR650. And today I'm going to tell you why the DR650 might actually be a much better option. So if that sounds interesting, let's get into it. So real quick before we get started, if any of you guys are unfamiliar with me and the channel, I test, compare, and build dual sport motorcycles here on YouTube for a living. I've tested big bikes like KLRs and a Tenere 700 in the past before moving to much lighter bikes like the 701 Enduro, XR650L, and DR650, which I've been slowly modifying to increase their road performance and comfort, and that's exactly what my plan is here for the DRZ4S. So if any of you guys are interested in that type of content, don't be afraid to hit that subscribe button. I'd love to have you watch it along each week. During this video, make sure you keep in mind that if you're not someone who needs to travel an hour or so at high speeds on the pavement to get to your trails like I do, a lot of this might simply not apply to you. Also, keep in mind that despite what the title of the video and the things that I'm going to be talking about might lead you to believe, I'm not saying that this is just flat out a better motorcycle than the DRZ4S. I'm a firm believer that there are no bad bikes out there, just a lot of riders who misinterpret their bike's designed intent, which is why I try to be as impartial as possible. However, if you'd like to respectfully share your opinion on these or any other machines, I'd love to discuss it down in the comments. So the very first thing is probably a pretty obvious one, and that's the cost. The DR650 here, the new MSRP, I think, is somewhere around $7,200 today anyways. That does fluctuate a bit. I think last year it was about $200 cheaper. The DRZ4S here, last time I checked, the Suzuki website had an MSRP set at $8,999. So that is a pretty decent chunk of change. I mean, you could almost pick up a used DR650 for the difference in cost between the two. And of course, the DRZ4S being still somewhat new on the scene here in the last year or so is gonna be a little bit harder to find in the used market, where the DR650 here has essentially remained more or less unchanged, aside from a few fixes over the years since, well, back before I was born, almost way back in the very early 90s. I did personally buy the DRZ4S here new. I wouldn't normally have done that before I started creating content for a living like I do now. The DR650, if you missed the videos, I actually traded my Gen 3 KLR 650 that was modded out for this bike, which was fairly close to stock, aside from, I suppose, the seat concept seat. The next thing I like more about the DR650 here is something that I think you really can't get a great grasp on until you basically hop off one and then on the other, and then maybe even hop back to the other one. And if you guys haven't seen them, I can link videos where I was out testing both of these bikes essentially in that same fashion. That really helps you get a feel for just how good the DR650 feels like it handles. And don't confuse handling with suspension, because those are two very different things, and we will talk a bit about that later. I'm talking about on a relatively flat surface where suspension doesn't come into play, because the DR650 here has a much lower center of gravity and a more gentle or increased rake angle in comparison to the DRZ4S. It just seems like it's a lot more willing to, well, stay upright. It doesn't feel like you're going to tip over when you go around corners. It just always feels really, well, stuck to the road or stuck to the trail. It doesn't really matter where you're riding. Again, as long as there aren't too many bumps, this bike just feels incredibly friendly to ride. And keep in mind, the DRZ4S is actually 33 pounds lighter than the DR650. That's a huge amount of weight, but yet it just does not feel like it because of this bike's low center of gravity and that nice easygoing rake. I think it's just a much better option for either somebody who's new to off-road riding or just wants an easier bike to ride, or maybe is a little bit closer to the ground, because the next thing is the seat height. The seat height on the DR650 here is literally almost 1.5 inches lower than the seat on the DRZ4S, which just makes it a lot more approachable, whether you're new to off-road riding or if you're just looking for something a little bit easier to ride because you're going to load the bike down with gear and take it camping, or maybe you're forced to ride solo like I am a lot of the time, or maybe you're even an older rider who's just looking to move to something a little bit more friendly to ride. Either way, the lower seat height and that lower center of gravity, sort of because of that, because obviously where your weight is also a factor of where the center of gravity is, this bike is just a much friendlier bike to ride. And like I mentioned, the DR650 does have a seat concept seat on it, but I have had a chance to ride a DR with a stock seat, my buddy Jason's performance build DR650, that I've got a playlist that I can link if you guys want to check that out, and we'll talk a bit about the performance mods and the abilities to do that on a DR650 later. But I have had some experience with the stock seat on that bike, and I can tell you that even with the stock seat, the DR650 is a much more comfortable bike to ride as far as the seat goes. It's just wider, it's a lot softer, and while I think the seat concept seat is certainly an upgrade over stock, the DRZ4S seat is basically, I think, as thin and as hard as you can get it and still have it be a usable dual sport seat.
Yeah, this is not going to be real comfortable.
This is a much more off-road oriented bike, and that's why they give you such a hard seat. Side note though, one thing I do like better about the DRZ4S seat in comparison to the stock DR650 seat is that, unlike the seat concept seat, the stock DR seat is made of a rather slippery material, which I really have come to dislike. Having a sort of gripper top seat like the seat concept seat has, or the slightly grippy kind of textured seat that the DRZ4S has, is just, well, really nice. It just kind of holds you in place, and it's just nice to have that extra traction. Now, I mentioned before when we were talking about the handling of the DR650 that I was strictly not talking about suspension, and that's because this bike is set up for a rider who, again, I think is looking for something that's much more comfortable to ride both on and off the road. This bike really does a pretty terrible job keeping the wheels on the ground and keeping that traction when you're riding it in places like the Tigerton off-road single track that I've tested it on. And if you guys have seen those videos, you've probably heard me whining and complaining about how bad the suspension is for that type of riding. But the thing is, like I mentioned to begin with, that is really only going to be an issue if you're expecting this bike to do really well in rough situations. It's something that's easily upgraded, and from what I've heard from a lot of you guys, does an excellent job in those situations. But the suspension that comes on this bike from the factory, I think, is purposefully designed to be sort of just a comfy backroad cruiser, where the DRZ4S is definitely a very hard, aggressive ride.
After getting off of the DR, this one kind of feels like you don't have any suspension. It's just a steel frame.
Yeah, it is a bit stiff.
That, of course, means that if you're gonna hit single track and you don't want to add any suspension components, then, well, the DRZ4S is by far a much better option. It takes jumps much better, where this bike can bottom out pretty easily. And all that aside, and as much as I've complained, which is really just me trying to convey the things that I've noticed about this bike, I'm actually incredibly impressed at how well this bike can do with the right type of rider, and with a rider that understands how to ride it and has the right attitude towards it. And I'm by no means an expert, but I have taken this bike through a lot of terrain that I think most people would probably assume that it wouldn't really be capable or fun in that type of situation. But to be honest, I think a lot of it really is just, again, going back to that sort of easygoing ride that this bike provides with the low center of gravity and the easy handling. It's just, I don't know, such a great bike to ride until you start to get into the really choppy stuff, and then you can lose traction pretty easy around the corners. So definitely be careful if you plan on riding this thing fast. Now, if it hasn't already become clear to you guys already, I think this next thing should definitely cement things for you like it has for me, in the fact that this is just a much more easygoing, more comfortable bike to ride. The thing that I like about this next point, though, is that it makes this bike a slightly better option in this category for something that you're maybe going to buy and build into an adventure dual sport type machine like I've been working on building this bike into, and that's the ergonomics of this bike, or the rider triangle, essentially how the rider interfaces with the seat, the bars, and the pegs, and sort of how that positions your body. The DRZ4S here, again, is designed and set up from the factory a little bit more for an aggressive rider, somebody who is going to be sitting sort of on the bike rather than in the bike.
Yeah, it really you're really sitting on top of it, though. It's like you have no feeling whatsoever of being inside of it, you know?
No, and I really didn't realize that this bike was a bike that you did sit in, but it
Yeah.
definitely feels like a bike you sit in, where that one, you're right, you're definitely on it like you're on a dirt bike.
That basically puts you up higher for a little bit more aggressive of a riding position. But if you're in a little bit more of an aggressive position, most of the time you're not in a very comfortable position. The same sort of transfers when you talk about standing or when you move to a standing position. On the DRZ4S with the stock bars and the stock peg height, I was really kind of leaned over the front of the bars.
Boy, yeah, these pegs are just high. But in some of these deep ruts, that's kind of nice because it keeps your feet out of harm's way.
And if you're somebody who's just going to ride really aggressively for a short period of time, or maybe you're in much better shape than I am, then, I mean, that's a great thing and a great option. It feels a lot more like a motocross bike for somebody who grew up riding motocross bikes and wants a road-going bike that feels similar. I mean, this is a perfect option. But if you're somebody who maybe has a little bit of a sore back once in a while and just wants to get out and cruise and doesn't plan on standing up and riding, or even if you do plan on standing up and riding, this bike I think is a lot more comfortable to do that for long periods of time. And I really like it because, well, you shouldn't be riding with a straight back and definitely not with locked knees on a trail or even on the road. This bike allows me to sort of stand up and stretch out a bit, which is really nice on those longer rides. And with all that being said, I think it is only fair to mention that I've had a set of risers and aftermarket bars on this bike for well over a year now. Bars and risers is usually something that I do on just about all my motorcycles. It's just sort of a personal preference thing. I like them a little bit higher. It just makes things more comfortable out on the road. And I've got plenty of videos that I'll link down in the description if you guys want to check that out. And while both of these bikes have their pegs in the stock peg height, it would be fairly easy to change. A lot of people move them down and back. Now, the next thing is one that you might never think about until you get the bike off-road on a trail and you find yourself in a tight spot where you need to turn it around, or maybe you get stuck. Really, even just moving the bikes around in the garage, I've noticed that I really miss having a decent set of grab handles on the DRZ4S. There is a little bit of a grab point underneath the rear fender where the rear subframe sort of loops around. It gives you a decent place to grab onto the bike, but nothing beats the awesome grab handles on the DR650 here. It is just something that once you have them, you just never want to go without. It's such a nice thing, and I feel like every dual sport motorcycle, maybe even just every motorcycle in general, should have them. It's just silly not to, and it's such a nice thing to have. This next thing is only going to be important for those of us who are going to spend a substantial amount of time on these bikes out in places where there aren't a whole lot of fuel stations, and that is the fuel capacity and range. Neither of these bikes have a giant tank on them. They do get substantially different fuel economies. I've noticed that I get somewhere around 60 miles to the gallon with the DRZ4S. And of course, your weight and riding style is going to make that fluctuate, as it would on the DR650, which I usually get somewhere around 50 miles to the gallon. Well, of course, like I mentioned, these numbers will fluctuate. With a 2.3 gallon tank, the DRZ4S should be able to get you somewhere around 138 miles to the tank. And the DR650 here, with its 3.2 gallon tank multiplied by its 50 miles to the gallon, should get you supposedly somewhere around 160 miles to the tank if you were able to completely run it dry, which of course you can't actually do. And of course the 4S is fuel injected and it doesn't have a fuel shutoff valve. So if the bike shuts off, you're not going to get it going again until you get more fuel in it. It lets you know that it's running low on fuel by the fuel gauge that's on it, which is helpful. However, watching the bar flash when you're running low and trying to get back to your trailer is a little bit nerve-wracking, and I'm speaking from experience there.
19 minutes, 13 miles. Can you do that?
We're gonna find out.
Otherwise, we'll be wishing I had these foot pegs.
Oh, that's right. That would be an interesting ride.
Although I suppose technically once you flip to reserve, you never really know exactly how many more miles you're going to get out of the DR650. It's just a little bit easier of a thing to notice, I suppose, and is kind of nice if you lose track of your miles. And if you guys are riding one of these machines, I'd love to hear your fuel economy numbers down in the description, either your best or your worst, or just even your average. And if you don't mind, stats like your height and weight, as well as the type of riding that you do, I think could also be helpful to those with similar body types and some similar riding needs. I don't have any sort of rack for camping gear on either one of these, and I've never strapped down the Tusk. I think it's the Excursion rackless system that you can install fairly easily with just some added clips, and that would allow you to basically carry a decent amount of luggage fairly low on either one of these bikes. But I don't have any experience with that yet, and while I do plan on putting racks from Tusk on both of these bikes, which I promise I will get to eventually Rocky Mountain. Sorry, I've been dragging my feet on that, but I don't have any experience with that yet. I also don't have any experience riding with a passenger on either one of these bikes, but because these bikes vary pretty substantially in the torque department, the DR650 here, the much bigger bore motor, having the higher torque or the higher torque output, is I think going to do a lot better in those types of situations. It also, I think, is going to have a little bit more tractor power when you're climbing things, where the DRZ4S is a little bit higher strung, and to get torque out of it, you have to have it revved up a little bit higher, and because it's just a smaller motor, it's not going to sort of help carry you through it.
Ooh, almost conked her out there.
And the funny thing about that is, actually, if you look at the dyno data from dirtrider.com on the DR650 here, it actually only puts out 1 horsepower more than the DRZ4S did. But regardless of which bike has more torque or horsepower, because of the amazing fueling on the DRZ4S, it is the most exciting, most snappy bike that I've ever ridden. And that, again, is in its completely stock form. The difference between these two in stock form is just mind-blowing.
This has got more pickup than that, Scott, though, huh?
Oh yeah, a lot.
Holy cow. I didn't expect that.
No, I didn't either when I first got on it, but it is a very peppy bike.
Even at 65, or maybe I was at 62, you punch it, it still takes off.
I know, that's what I said it. It's almost like an electric motor where it just like doesn't matter what you're doing. If you hit the throttle, it goes.
Nothing is ever really quite fast enough for me. It could always be just a little bit faster, regardless of whether I actually use it ever or not. But when I ride this bike on single track, it actually has way too much snappy power. I simply just have to drop it to those lowest settings to even make it work right. It's just way too much. But again, it's just a blast out on the road. Wait, which bike am I trying to tell you to buy here? All that aside, though, the DR650 here really is a pretty impressive bike with just a few quick, easy mods. And that is sort of my next point. If you're somebody that likes to kind of get your hands dirty and get in there and mod things like Jason did on his DR650, the DR is just a much easier bike to do that type of thing on because it's carbureted. But the DRZ4S, if you're even going to make any sort of upgrade to it, you're going to have to pay somebody a pretty large amount of money to update the bike's brain. And if you guys are interested in seeing what you can get out of a performance modded DR650, I would highly recommend you guys check out either the performance mod videos or the comparisons we did, because this bike seems a lot slower and dog-ear and just takes a while to get power out of it, where the XR650 just always really hit right away. But after Jason did the mods to his DR650, when we took the XR and his performance modded DR out, his DR felt way snappier than the XR650L.
Ooh, yeah, this does have more pull. Wow. Do you think so too or not? Not so much.
Yeah. I was trying to find the right gear. I'm like, oh, I think I am in the right gear. It just doesn't pull as hard.
Yeah. That's crazy.
Now, this next one isn't something that really bothers me too much, but I think if you're somebody who's going to buy one of these bikes and plans on keeping it for a long time, actually, these next couple things are really going to be helpful, especially if you're going to be going out on long adventures where you're not going to be close to home or have the option to have somebody come help you or support you if you run into issues. The DR just doesn't really have a whole lot in the way of electronics. It's carbureted, so you don't need really much to run the bike other than, I suppose, the spark itself. The DRZ4S, there's just a lot of other stuff going on, just the fuel modes, traction control, the ABS. There's just a lot built into this bike. The throttle itself, while it does have cables that are actually attached to the tube that you spin, those go into a little device that sort of measures what you're doing with the throttle. And the fuel injection itself is actually modulated by an electronic actuator that signal is sort of transmitted to. So there's basically a lot of things on this bike that are really nice for, like I mentioned, adjusting the amount of power that you're getting out of the bike. I love the ability to do that when you're riding road and then want to hop on the single track. And while I don't personally ever see myself using the traction control, I do really like that the DRZ has ABS. It just adds a nice layer of safety. And even beyond that, if you're considering these two bikes, or especially I guess if you're considering the DR, you should definitely keep in mind that its brakes are some of the worst that I have ever used. You might be able to get a bit more performance out of them if you swap the lines out for steel braided lines and swap the pads out for something that would perform a little bit better. But in general, its brakes, well, leave a lot to be desired and are certainly not the safest thing out there on the market.
Do you want to do like a 30-mile-an-hour brake test?
How so?
How about just at the, not this one, but the next power line pole?
Oh, the next pole right here?
So this one right here, yeah. Ready? Now. Oops, I guess I forgot to downshift too.
And part of it could be me just not wanting to crash too.
Yeah, it is hard to make yourself, in an emergency situation, it's a little bit different, but yeah, it's kind of like, I don't really want to drop it. And I've got ABS too, which actually kicked in on the back.
Yeah, because I mean, you can see how far my front was dipping down. Because I don't even think I locked it up, so I'm sure I could do better.
Yeah.
But I was too paranoid.
Yeah, that is the problem with the bike without ABS. If you get going into a skid, all of a sudden things can go sideways quickly.
I've locked it up the fronts and the rears before, you know, but you manually ABS it before you wipe out, you know.
Right, yeah.
But all of those electronics leave a lot of room for error in the future. They're not going to be just as simple as, you know, taking something apart quickly, cleaning something, and then putting it back together. I mean, it could be a huge deal that lands the bike in a shop for a long period of time. Even just getting into this bike is so much simpler. I mean, to remove the tank, it's just right there where the DRZ4S actually kind of has it hidden inside of a bunch of plastic. There's a lot more fairings and stuff to take off. Even the procedure to check the oil level on the 4S is something you probably are going to have to go back to the owner's manual, or maybe remember, where the DR, basically you just tip it upright, look in the sight glass, and you can see what you've got for oil in there. Because of course, if you're unfamiliar, the DR650 actually carries its oil in the bottom of the engine, where the 4S keeps it kind of high up in its frame. And while I haven't done a valve check on either one of them, the 4S, you have to essentially remove the top portion of the motor to get at the valves, which are shim and bucket, and you're actually gonna have to switch shims out if they're not in spec. Where at the DR650 here, you do have to pull the tank off, I suppose, but then that will expose the little inspection ports for the valves, and you don't have to switch out any shims. You can just stick your little feeler gauge down in there, check where the valve lash is at, and if it needs to be adjusted, it's as simple as loosening up a locking nut, making the adjustment, and then tightening everything back down and putting it all back together. And while I certainly wouldn't want to do either one of them on the road or the trail, if you're somebody that's going to be out and traveling, I would say it's probably going to be a much easier thing to do on the side of the road or in a parking lot on the DR in comparison to the 4S, which I would assume probably requires some sort of gasket sealer. And obviously, if you're taking that all apart, there's just a lot more that can go wrong putting everything back together and tightening things down with the DRZ4S in comparison to the DR650. And that sort of spills over into my next point here as well, and that's the fact that because this bike has been around for, well, the last 30 or so years, there's a lot of aftermarket parts out there for it. There's also a lot of used parts out there for it. And really, even if you just need to purchase a new part, it should be a lot easier to get hold of in comparison to the basically brand new DRZ4S, which is slowly starting to get more aftermarket parts available. But being that it's pretty new, you're probably not going to find a whole lot of used options out there if you're out on a trip somewhere and have a breakdown, or even if you just bust something and need to find new parts. It's going to be a lot easier to do that on a bike that has 30 years of other bikes being out there. And of course, they have changed some small things, done some fixes over the years, but for the most part, this bike has remained unchanged for a really long time. And I think a lot of people just sort of find some peace just even in that. Now, this next thing is sort of along the same lines, but it's actually one that's on my mind a lot when I'm taking both of these bikes off-road, especially in tight trails or around a lot of obstacles. And that's the fact that the DRZ4S is liquid cooled, meaning that it has some rather large, easy to grab radiator hoses that you could simply just yank off or break off while running through tight brush. It also has rather large radiators on it that stick out quite a ways, and depending on the terrain you're riding on, even though I've got a set of Tusk D-Flex handguards on here, which sort of help keep the bike away from the ground a little bit. Again, if you're on uneven terrain, you could easily end up dropping the radiator right onto a rock and busting that all up, and that's going to be, well, basically a trip ender unless you can figure out some way to seal the bike back up. And if you guys haven't seen it, the Rocky Mountain crew actually ran into an issue with their DRZ4S where they didn't bust up the radiator, but busted one of the hoses up, and then actually used one of their really neat products that I always carry on my rides, and that is some silicone wrap that basically self-adheres and allowed them to seal that back up on the trail. Again, if that was the radiator though, you'd probably kind of be out of luck. And to be fair, the DR650 here does technically have a radiator on it, but even though it still has that radiator and those coolant lines, they're much smaller, they're tucked in, the radiator's only on one side, and I'm told that if you do run into a situation where you bust up your radiator on the DR650, in order to limp home, you can actually just bypass the radiator altogether. Of course, you're not going to get the same amount of cooling, but I think it would be a lot easier to get this bike home as long as you're moving at a good clip, getting enough air over the cooling fins, where the DRZ4S doesn't have any cooling fins, so without its radiators and its coolant being pumped through with the water pump, it's going to overheat really quickly. Which again, I think is why this bike is meant for kind of longer backroad cruises and adventures, where the DR650 is meant to rip hard on trails that if you tip it over and bust it on, well, you're going to just have to limp it back to the trailer and haul it home. Now, I don't know anything more than anybody else out there on the internet about this, but like I've been speculating and talking to a lot of you guys in the comment sections on my videos, if a DR650 is something that you think you would be interested in because you don't want safety features like ABS, you don't want all the electronics, you just want something that's simple to work on, comfortable to get on and ride, and you don't have to think about much of anything other than just getting out and enjoying this beautiful world God created for us to explore and enjoy, there's not really a better option out there. And I think this bike is probably going to disappear sometime in the future, at least as far as buying brand new ones, because I would guess, much like they updated the old DRZ400 here, and really I think did a phenomenal job, I think they're probably working on doing the same thing on the DR650. Like I said, I have no idea if that's fact, but my guess would be they're probably doing the same thing. Not because this bike necessarily needs anything. I think if they did essentially the same stuff that they did with the DRZ400, basically just kind of updating some things, making it really snappy and have those fuel modes, I think if they transfer that stuff over to the DR650, along with its ability to then be sold, and I think that's the main reason that they did a lot of the updates on this bike, or even updated to begin with, is that this bike was not able to be sold in a whole lot of places other than the US, and that is the case for the DR650, and a lot of you guys overseas tell me that you wish you could get a hold of a DR650 or an XR650. My guess is they're probably going to be updating this bike to be compliant in those places where the old model just isn't because of the carburetor. So if you're looking to get a piece of history, an old carbureted bike with no ABS and just a really simple, beautiful design from the past, I think you could certainly pick yourself one up new today and own a piece of history for a long period of time. But in the future, I would guess that you're probably not going to be able to do that. And I know that will make a lot of you guys upset if that happens. But to be honest, I have seen the future with the 4S here, and while, like I've shown during this video, there still are a lot of great things about this bike, I think it could be made even better in a lot of the categories and for a lot of people. Not everyone, of course, if it was updated like the 4S was. And like I said, there are a lot of things that I like about the 4S, and if you guys are interested in this bike, really either bike, I've got a lot of stuff out there that you guys can check out already, and I will eventually do a video explaining why there are reasons, like I've sort of touched on in this video, to go with the 4S over the DR650, but either one I think could be a great fit for you. The best thing to do is to throw a leg over each of them, take them out for a ride, and see what you think, because really that's the only opinion that actually matters. But regardless of what bike you've got in the garage right now, if you can get out there and ride it and explore and enjoy this beautiful world God created for us to enjoy, make sure you get out and do that. If you can't right now, though, here's some more videos to check out. In the meantime, huge thanks for watching. Make sure you share and like this video if you found it helpful. Until next time, take care, stay safe, stay swanky, and we'll catch you on the next one.